woke up on Christmas morning hoping that Santa had left a Eagles victory in their stockings for Christmas Day afternoon. Well, the Eagles had a really ugly game ultimately when it all came down to it. And it was one of those games where you were wondering if the Eagles were going to hang on. It's very emblematic of a lot of their wins over the course of this season. But at the end of the day, the Eagles were able to pull away with the victory against the New York Giants by a final score of 33-25. Welcome to the Bird's Nest Podcast. I'm Joe Donahue. Thank you so much for joining us. The Eagles were able to give Eagles fans the Christmas victory that the Eagles fans were wishing for, but maybe not in the manner that Eagles fans were hoping for. And I'm sure a lot of fans are going to be filing this game under wins that we actually hated. Because at the end of the day, this was not emblematic of a great performance. The Eagles' victory was very ugly, especially in the second half. The Eagles' victory was just down and out frustrating as we saw the team struggle at times to get things going. We saw inconsistent play. We saw more turnovers. We saw head-scratching moments that really made you question how far is this team actually going to go when the Eagles play in the playoffs this season. Now, during the first half, the Philadelphia Eagles were actually very much in control. They were on top 20-3 against the New York Giants. And it all started first by the Eagles defense holding the Giants to a 3-and-out. But then Britton Covey was able to return a punt 54 yards. And before we go any further, I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge Britton Covey. Covey, over the course of this game, had 3 punt returns, grand total of 66 yards, including the 54-yarder that he returned, set the Eagles up beautifully for their first touchdown of the game. And while Covey did, in fact, muff one, the other 2 punt returns were really good. Covey also was on the board for the receiving game. He had 1 catch for 7 yards. It's his first catch as a professional football player. So Covey making his debut on the Eagles offense, and he has a lot to celebrate this game. But the Eagles in total were just the dominant team in the first half. The Eagles had 212 offensive yards on 35 plays. 61 of that came on the ground. 151 of that came through the air. The Giants were held to just 101 yards in that first half. And Tommy DeVito, who was coming in with all of the attention on him, was only able to muster up 9 for 16 in the passing game for 55 yards. He was sacked once. It was actually the only sack the Eagles were able to deliver against the Giants over the course of this game. More effective in the game was Saquon Barkley, who in the first half had 13 carries for 43 yards. Saquon Barkley actually would go on to finish the game with 23 carries for 80 yards. And that was definitely an area of concern for me with the Eagles defense, was the fact that the Eagles defense kind of felt like, once again, allowing a running back to basically have their way with the Eagles defense. So the Eagles collectively were the dominant team in the first half. But what happened? Well, it came down to towards the end of the first half, the Eagles' final drive of the first half, actually, where the Eagles were starting to show signs of weakness, especially offensively. The Eagles, moving down the field, were making a few poor decisions as they were getting down to the very end. The Eagles had already burned their final timeout, and Jalen Hurts was able to get downfield, get into prime field goal position, but unfortunately, he was not able to get out of bounds, and so because of that, the Eagles looked like they were going to be unable to clock the football. Now, the Eagles benefited from a Giants defensive mistake. The Giants were called for a defensive delay of game penalty, so the Eagles were able to walk out of there with a field goal to go into halftime, and that's what wound up putting them up 20-3. But there were a number of those boneheaded decisions. Another one happened earlier in the game where Jalen Carter was called for offsides, and that actually negated a Giants punt. But the Eagles were still able to go into halftime in control, and they came out of halftime and they received this opening kickoff of the second half. And that's where the Eagles' second half woes started, because on that opening kickoff of the second half, Boston Scott fields it and he starts running with the football. And unfortunately, what happened was Olamide Zaccheaus seemed to have been blocked into Boston Scott, and the collision caused Scott to drop the football. That was recovered by the Giants. It gave the Giants great field position, their best field position of the day, deep in Eagles territory, and it wound up resulting in the first Giants touchdown of the game. And that definitely left Eagles fans with a lot of concern, because that was a big momentum shifter. The Eagles actually would not score at all during the third quarter. They did get deep into Giants territory, but when they were starting their play on the Giants' 28-yard line, Jalen Hurts threw a pick six. Now, Hurts' pick six was absolutely frustrating. It was emblematic of the third quarter for the Eagles. The pick six went to Adoree Jackson, who returned it for 76 yards, and Hurts topped it off with a horse collar at the end of it. Jalen Hurts has now thrown 13 interceptions on the season. It is a career high for him. Jalen Hurts finished the game 24 for 38, 301 yards, 1 passing touchdown, 1 interception. Those were decent numbers. Again, I would like to see Jalen Hurts not throw that interception and make a couple of better decisions, because there were a lot of passes that he just kind of telegraphed. And especially given that he was 11 for 19 in the passing game in the first half, definitely concerning. The Eagles' defensive performance in the first half led to the Giants benching Tommy DeVito. Again, he finished the game 9 for 16 for 55 yards. Couldn't really get anything going in the first half. So they switched it up to Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod Taylor went 7 for 16 in the second half for 133 passing yards, 1 touchdown. And Taylor also ran twice for a total of 21 yards. Now, one of the biggest frustrations for me on the defensive end of the football was the fact that the Giants are worst in the league in terms of allowed sacks. And what happened? Well, the Giants gave up 1 sack total. The Eagles could not get to either Tommy DeVito or Tyrod Taylor with any degree of consistency. They were definitely getting back in the offensive backfield, and that's definitely something to note, but they were not able to really bring it home. And the only sack occurred during the first half against DeVito. Taylor was not sacked at all during the game. So there were lots of head-scratching moments throughout this. The play of the game, though, was one play that occurred at the start of the fourth quarter. It was 3rd and 20. Jalen Hurts found A.J. Brown over the hand of a leaping Isaiah Simmons, and Brown was able to extend that drive, gave the Eagles another opportunity at a touchdown. The Giants never held the lead during this game, but they came pretty close to at that moment. And the Eagles setting up a touchdown that put them ahead by multiple scores again at that point. It sort of helped realign the team, and be able to move them forward. So that 3rd and 20 conversion set up things and gave the Eagles some life back, gave the Eagles some momentum back, and the Eagles were able to pull away and were able to drop 30 points, 33 points at the end of it, on a New York Giants team that they held on, but they could not come away with the victory. And again, as we've been saying here quite a bit over the course of the last several weeks, over the course of this entire season, there's a lot that this Eagles team needs to clean up. This Eagles team is playing sloppy football. They've turned the ball over quite a bit, and this Eagles team just really has been frustrating. But when it did come down to it, the Eagles were able to come away with the victory, because even though the Giants at the end of the game had to go 75 yards in 70 seconds with 0 timeouts left in the game, the Eagles defense fed them 15 free yards, and the Giants moved down the field even more so beyond that. But at the end of the game, what happened? The Eagles were able to pick off Tyrod Taylor, thanks to Kelly Ringo intercepting that ball in the end zone, to seal the game and to seal the victory. And yes, it was sloppy, and yes, it was frustrating, and yes, there are definitely lots of areas to improve upon still. This Eagles team is playing sloppy football. Running backs are still cutting up the Eagles secondary. The Eagles' offense does not have an answer for the blitz. Again, Jalen Hurts was under pressure quite a bit all game, mostly because the Giants were sending extra guys. But the Eagles players and the Eagles fans should be very, very grateful that on this Christmas Day, an ugly win counts just as much as a dominating win. But as the Eagles go through and they face off against the Arizona Cardinals next week, and then the New York Giants again at MetLife to close out the regular season, they need to figure out some things and use these next couple of games against weaker opponents to try to figure out what's this team going to look like as they enter the postseason. The Eagles right now hold on to the top spot in the NFC East. They need to win out and then hope for some losses by the Detroit Lions and the San Francisco 49ers if they would like to move up in the NFC standings. But as always, let me know what you think in the comments below. What are your thoughts about this Eagles victory? Where do you see areas of concern, areas that the Eagles need to focus on as we head into the final 2 weeks of the regular season? Let me know. And thank you so much to everybody for tuning in to the Bird's Nest Podcast. You can support the Bird's Nest Podcast by liking and subscribing to Bird's Nest Media right here on YouTube, as well as by sharing to your social media pages. You can also find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play Music, Amazon Podcasts, and Spotify. Please visit birdsnestmedia.com for additional Eagles coverage. And if you feel so inclined to support us in a different way, you can find the link to our Patreon in the description below or at birdsnestmedia.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. For those of you who celebrate, have a very Merry Christmas. And let's go, Eagles.